I don't think the public knows what that Oscar means to us. It is one of the most emotional things that can ever happen to a human being.
While working on this video, I asked my friends, what's the first thing you think about when you think about Joan Crawford? No joke, the number one answer was eyebrows, which I have to admit I was a little surprised by, but I guess she does have great eyebrows, so fair. But besides eyebrows, though, I got exactly what I expected. It's easy to reduce Joan Crawford's impact on entertainment when this and this are the most recent representations of her persona. I get a kick out of this stuff as much as the next person, but campy exploitation, unsurprisingly, doesn't give the fullest depiction of her work or legacy, especially when you realize that for a long time, audiences thought of her like this. We end up losing a lot of what actually made her career interesting. A long journey and a lot of hard work took Joan from silent extra to Academy Award winner in 1946. In this video, we'll talk about what made Joan popular in the first place, her relationship with MGM, and why her Oscar win is a comeback story for the ages. Joan Crawford signed her first contract with MGM in 1924. And through a series of small roles, she progressed from complete anonymity to a promising prospect, eventually sharing the screen with silent legends like Lon Chaney and John Gilbert. When it became clear she could survive the transition to sound films in the late 1920s, MGM gave Joan more and better opportunities, eventually elevating her to a romantic lead. Soon enough, she was one of the most bankable, highest-paid stars on the lot. Understanding why Joan took off in the 1930s adds some much-needed nuance to her characterization as a Hollywood icon, and it's crucial to understand how Mildred Pierce was received later on. The bulk of her years at MGM, which arguably constituted the height, or at least a peak of her fame, occurred during the Great Depression. It's difficult to comprehend how deeply disruptive the Depression was, how thoroughly it upended American society. Movies became an escape, and although attendance dropped as fewer people could afford tickets, the people who did go wanted to see something different from the grim reality of American life in the 30s. And they definitely got that. Movies about the idle rich were more common than not, and many stars could fully sustain their personas simply by wearing expensive gowns and furs. But Joan was slightly different. She had a guiding principle when it came to choosing roles.
I try to get a film that has audience identification.
In the 1920s, audience identification looked like a flapper. In the 30s, Joan's movies told Cinderella stories about the working class. Her characters began, for example, in a kitchen or at a factory, and through grit and force of will, they ascended into that glamorous upper echelon. To audiences who lived with the Great Depression, she embodied the escapist fantasy version of what was possible for them. Movie magazines highlighted that Joan's real life also echoed this journey. She once said, quote, "People know how hard I had it when I was young, how I went to work when I was 9. They know how close I feel to them," end quote. In the words of Janine Basinger, audiences, quote, "formed an allegiance to her determined climb, to her attempt to be something other than what she really was, an ambitious woman and an angry woman," end quote. Eventually, though, times changed and the roles became stale. In the late 30s, MGM shoved her into roles that demanded little more from her than wearing a nice dress, or felt like poorly done replicas of her past work. In 1938, she, along with Garbo, Hepburn, and others, were infamously named box office poison. Part of this was because of MGM, which was actively shifting its resources toward its crop of newer, younger stars like Judy Garland and Lana Turner. Of particular concern to Joan was the 1939 arrival of Greer Garson, who was closest to her in age. MGM seemed keen to provide Greer with prestige dramas to fuel her popularity. So by 1943, she was a 4-time nominee and an Academy Award winner, and Joan hadn't even been nominated. With the exception of The Women, she felt like she wasn't getting anything worth her time. MGM was equally dissatisfied, unsure of Joan's role in their new stable of stars and losing money on her films for the first time. So, as the story goes, Joan and MGM mutually terminated her contract in 1943. This was absolutely a pivotal moment for Joan. There was no guarantee that she was making the right decision, considering she was a woman pushing 40 who just cut ties from her home of almost 20 years. Her situation exposed a harsh reality about Hollywood, and again, an opportunity to understand her role in its history. Every star interacted with the studio system in a different way. Bette Davis challenged it, Barbara Stanwyck subverted it, Katharine Hepburn overcame it. Joan Crawford embraced it. Joan was an intensely ambitious and professional woman. Even Bette Davis would admit to that.
But I will say this for Miss Crawford. She is a professional. She is always on time. She knows her lines. And we made Jane, you know, in 3 weeks, Joan and I. I had great respect for her as a professional. That she is.
To her, success came through compliance. I'm not saying she wasn't disagreeable at times or that she didn't have her quirks. What I'm saying is she was a really hard worker who wanted to be great at her job and who did what she was told. She knew her reputation depended on being professional, so contrary to some things you may have seen, she was quite cooperative with MGM and played ball to succeed. Take how she maneuvered in relation to Greer Garson. When MGM pulled Greer out of Susan and God to put her in the more prestigious Pride and Prejudice, Joan accepted MGM's request for her to step in, even if she knew it wasn't the right role for her.
It's just love, love, love.
She also showed up happily for When Ladies Meet, a film which makes it very clear who MGM liked better, and is also very fascinating, so watch that if you have a chance. The point is, her divorce from MGM proved at least one thing about the movie industry, which is you can be an A student, you can do what you're told and make a lot of money, but you are considered replaceable, and your exit will be unceremonious. Thankfully, Warner Brothers offered Joan a contract shortly after she left MGM. She had learned important lessons, though, and was determined not to accept anything less than she thought she deserved, or that wouldn't help grow her career. So for 2 years, Joan turned down every role Warner Brothers offered her, claiming that the scripts weren't up to par. From 1943 to 1945, Joan made only one brief appearance in film, a cameo as herself in Hollywood Canteen. A 2-year absence could seriously have been career suicide at a time when stars could make 3 films a year. But Joan bided her time and waited for the right thing to come along. And it did. A highly sanitized adaptation of James N. Cain's novel Mildred Pierce was circling the Warner Brothers lot. It's hard to pin down who exactly was offered what or rejected the role and when. Accounts vary, but it seems everyone was considered, from Bette Davis to Ida Lupino to Barbara Stanwyck, who director Michael Curtiz allegedly preferred. But eventually, Joan found out about it, and in typical Crawford fashion, she decided the role was hers for the taking. She reluctantly conducted a screen test for a skeptical Curtiz and won him over and the role. Mildred Pierce tells the story of a working-class woman who begins a thriving business after her husband leaves her for another woman. As her business succeeds, she must learn to juggle the demands of her spoiled daughter and the men in her life. Soon, everything unravels into a mystery of deception and betrayal. It's easy to understand why Joan wanted this role, and what Curtiz must have seen in that screen test. As film scholar Greg Garrett noted, quote, Crawford was known for the vitality and almost masculine drive she displayed on screen. In many ways, Mildred Pierce was a logical continuation, end quote. Mildred's energy, brains, ambition, and ruthlessness harnessed Crawford's ambition like an oil strike. Still, the film made an important departure from the rags to riches trope of Crawford's earlier roles. As June Sochin notes, the poor but lovely woman not only reached the peaks of success, but also experienced the depths of failure. Mildred Pierce combines the characteristics of a woman's film from the 1930s with unmistakably noir elements, high contrast cinematography, flashbacks, and of course, murder. Ethan Mordden called it, quote, an apotheosis of Crawford's MGM Cinderellas in the dark disquiet of Warner's film noir, end quote. Once again, Joan found a role with audience identification. Mildred Pierce was released in fall 1945, just as soldiers were coming home from the war, and women faced a return to domesticity after an unprecedented level of independence. Mildred Pierce sends about as mixed messages about women and work as real women actually felt back then. On the one hand, we admire Mildred for building a successful chain of restaurants all by herself. And on the other hand, Mildred's inability to effectively manage her family condemns her work as an unnecessary distraction. In a society that, as Sochin notes, quote, wanted to return to normalcy, to the status quo antebellum, Mildred Pierce captures the tension in enjoying and feeling guilty about independence, and the ultimate acknowledgement that women had to return to the home. Mildred Pierce performed really well at the box office, earning over $5 million, helped in no small measure by its resonance with female audiences and by the fact of Joan's return. Joan's performance was well reviewed as well, and critics took note of her darker turn. That spring, the Best Actress category read like a real who's who of Academy favorites of the 1940s. The previous year's winner, Ingrid Bergman, received her third nomination for The Bells of St. Mary's. 1944 winner Jennifer Jones received her third nomination for Love Letters. And of course, there was 1943 winner Greer Garson with her sixth nomination for The Valley of Decision. Joan and Gene Tierney, nominated for Leave Her to Heaven, both received their first nominations, although Jones had a very different connotation. Gene was relatively new, so a first nomination reads pretty normal. But it seems strange that this was Joan's first, after 20 years in the business and given her popularity. Joan also had a good 15 years on Gene. We think of age as a barrier to success for women now, but consider that Joan's nomination for Mildred Pierce marks the only time in the 1940s that a woman in her 40s won Best Actress. Ironically, she owed her win in part to her age. The very elements that made her performance great had roots in real learned experiences, the ups and downs of professional success, and let's say, complicated mother-daughter relationships. Significantly, the discourse surrounding her nomination focused primarily on her staying power and longevity, an about-time, sentimental kind of conversation. They praised her hard, determined work and claimed it had gone underappreciated by her studio. Mildred Pierce was a comeback not just from 2 years away from the screen, but also from MGM's mismanagement of her career. Joan famously did not attend the Oscars, claiming that she was too ill to go. Was she sick? Maybe. It seems more likely that to an extreme perfectionist like Joan, the potential embarrassment of not winning or the anxiety of giving an acceptance speech overwhelmed the desire to be there. And for a long time, Joan believed she'd never win an Oscar, that MGM had too much political power and didn't want it to happen. And history would have told her she was right. During her time there, MGM funneled most of its awards attention to Norma Shear, Louise Reiner, and Greer Garson. But Warner Brothers mounted a full campaign for her. And so finally, with studio backing, the perfect narrative, a box office hit, audience resonance, and 20 years in the business, she won. When her name was announced, Michael Curtiz accepted it on her behalf, then personally delivered the statue to her at home, of course, with a photographer in tow. Rob Nixon wrote, quote, "Winning the Academy Award on her first nomination brought new respect for the actress who had clawed her way to the top and put her back in the category of major stars," unquote. From flapper to shop girl to clothes horse, Joan reinvented herself again with Mildred Pierce. It revived and launched a new phase in her career as a noble, middle-aged career woman in noirish melodramas exploring desire and possessiveness. The late 1940s saw many of Joan's greatest performances in films like Humoresque, Daisy Kenyon, and Possessed. She was nominated for Oscars 2 more times. At that point, very few actresses had lasted from the silent era, and even fewer lasted and had the attention of the Academy. So it's kind of remarkable to consider that Joan's relevance lasted into the 1950s and then revived again in the 60s with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. James Cain summarized Joan's story best. For 2 years, Joan Crawford gave up her security and studied scripts. She found a great story at last, and an Oscar. More than many of her peers, Joan understood and reflected the climb to the top on screen and in real life, the need to earn respect. She strategically created her own image and career, taking enormous risks and eventually becoming one of the most remembered stars of the classic era. Of course, some of this has to do with the camp element that I talked about at the beginning of this episode. But I think by contextualizing her career, especially her early work, and reframing Joan in the context of her screen persona, we get a more nuanced understanding of who she was and why she was important. This is a woman Molly Haskell called about as wobbly as the Statue of Liberty. So there's a lot more to it than just eyebrows.